He turned his back on her before she could even speak. That was it. No explanation, no apology, just 3 words. You're not her. Spoken loud enough for every soul on that frozen platform to hear. And then Graham Voss walked away like Eliza Marlowe was nothing more than a mistake he intended to leave behind in the snow. She didn't cry. Not right there, not with 11 strangers watching, but her hands, those careful, steady hands that had once held a classroom together, were shaking so hard she nearly dropped her bag. If that were you, standing alone in a strange town, rejected in front of everyone, with nowhere to go and no one coming, what would you do? Before you find out what happened next, if stories like this speak to something in your heart, the kind that remind you that people can be broken and still become unbreakable, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happened next on that platform changed everything. The train had already gone. Eliza Marlowe stood on the platform of Coldwater Junction, Wyoming, with a battered leather trunk at her feet, a woolen coat that wasn't quite thick enough for January, and the particular stillness of a woman who has already survived the worst thing she can imagine, and is now discovering that the world has invented something new. She had read Graham Voss's letters 17 times. She knew that number exactly because she had counted them during the 3-day journey west, reading each one again in the thin gray light of the passenger car, telling herself that the careful, measured words on those pages belonged to a man of substance, a man who meant what he wrote, a man who described his ranch, his cattle, his late wife's flower garden that had gone to seed, and his need for a woman with practical skills and a steady disposition. She had written back honestly. She had told him about her teaching, about the fire, about the years she had spent putting herself back together in her sister's spare room in Ohio. She hadn't pretended to be whole. She had only promised to be hardworking. He had written back, "I believe you are exactly what this ranch needs." So she had come. The moment she stepped off that train, she saw him. She knew it was him. The photograph he had sent showed a square-jawed man somewhere around 40, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of face that looked like it had been weathered rather than aged. She had thought the photograph made him look solid, dependable. What the photograph had not shown was the way his expression would move when he saw her. A flicker of something she could only call revision, like a man looking at a contract and realizing too late that the terms were not what he had assumed. He walked toward her. She took one step forward, her hand already beginning to rise in greeting. "You're not the woman I expected," he said. She stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "The letter. The description." He looked at her once, head to foot, with the kind of assessment a man gives livestock at auction. "You're not what was described." Eliza had no idea what that meant. She was 31 years old, brown-haired, plain-featured, and she had described herself in exactly those terms. She opened her mouth to say so. He turned and walked away. Just like that. The back of his coat, the creak of his boots on the platform boards. Gone. She stood there for a long moment, absolutely unable to process what had just happened. Around her, she was aware, without looking, that people were watching. A man near the ticket window. 2 women by the general store steps. A boy holding a horse's lead who was staring with the open, guiltless curiosity of someone too young to know he should pretend not to. Eliza pressed her lips together and sat down on the bench beside her trunk. The bench had a crack running through the middle of the seat. She felt it immediately through her skirt. She shifted, placed her hands in her lap, and stared at the mountain range in the distance while she decided what she was going to do. She had $41.30. She had a trunk containing her clothes, a small collection of books, her dead mother's sewing kit, and a framed photograph of her family home before the fire. She had no relatives west of Cincinnati. The return ticket she had planned to buy would cost approximately $22, which would leave her with $19 to rebuild a life in a city where she knew no one. She was running these numbers with the calm precision of a woman who taught arithmetic because she genuinely found it useful when she heard a small voice say, "Are you sad?" She looked down. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, small for her age, with dark eyes and hair the color of creek mud in November. She was wearing a coat that had been mended so many times the original fabric was nearly invisible beneath the patches. She was holding a book against her chest like a shield. "I'm thinking," Eliza said. "That's what my papa does when he's sad," the girl said. He goes real quiet and looks far away. You were looking far away. Eliza looked at her properly then. The child had the serious, watchful quality of someone who had been taking note of adult behavior for a long time and had drawn some careful conclusions. There was no shyness in her, but no boldness either, just attention. What's your name? Eliza asked. Wren Calder. That's an unusual name. My mama picked it. A pause. A small adjustment of the book against her chest. She died. Eliza absorbed this. I'm sorry. It was 14 months ago. Wren said it the way children sometimes say hard things, with a kind of clinical precision, as though the facts themselves were manageable, even when nothing else was. I counted. Eliza nodded. She understood counting. What's in the book? She asked. Wren held it out. It was a collection of illustrated fables, the spine cracked, and the cover soft with use. I can read the short words, Wren said. The long ones I get stuck on. Papa tries to help, but he gets busy. She looked at Eliza with that direct, assessing gaze. Can you read the hard words? Something shifted in Eliza's chest. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was more like recognition, the sensation of a hand finding a familiar tool. I used to be a teacher, Eliza said. Wren's eyes widened slightly, not with excitement, but with the particular attention of someone receiving important information. She held the book out further. Eliza took it. She opened it to the first page and began to read aloud, and the words came out in the voice she had not used in over a year. The steady, unhurried, classroom voice that had nothing to prove and everything to share. Wren sat down beside her on the cracked bench, leaning close enough that Eliza could feel the warmth of her small shoulder. They were on the third fable when the shadow fell across them. Eliza looked up. The man standing there was tall, lean in the way that comes from working rather than thinness, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of hands that spoke their own biography in calluses and scars. He was looking at his daughter first, and his expression, which had been tight with something close to worry, shifted when he saw the child's face. Because Wren was smiling. It was a small smile, careful and real, the kind that doesn't offer itself easily. Then he looked at Eliza, and the tightness came back. Wren, he said, I told you to wait by the wagon. I was waiting, Wren said. Then I came here instead. Papa, she's a teacher. She reads the hard words. The man studied Eliza with the same careful, measuring attention his daughter had, but layered with something else. The protective wariness of a parent who has learned that the world can damage what he loves and is not inclined to give it opportunities. I'm sorry if she bothered you, he said. The apology was genuine but minimal, the way a man apologizes when he is already moving on to something else in his mind. She didn't, Eliza said. She stood, which she did partly out of habit and partly because she was tired of being looked down at. She's good company. He nodded once. I need to get her home. Storm's coming in. Papa, Wren said, she doesn't have anywhere to go. Silence. Eliza opened her mouth to say something. She wasn't sure what. Some version of I'll be perfectly fine that wasn't entirely true. But the man spoke first. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't warmth. It was closer to the look of a man doing math. Is that true? He asked. Eliza considered lying. It would have been easy. I have arrangements. 3 words, and she could preserve her dignity and sleep in the train station until she figured out something better. For tonight, she said instead. I had arrangements that fell through. He was quiet for a moment. The wind had picked up. She could feel it finding the gaps in her coat, insisting on itself. I'm Silas Calder, he said finally. I've got a working ranch 3 miles out, spare room that's not being used. My housekeeper left 2 months ago, and I haven't had anyone to help manage the house and see to Wren's lessons. He paused. I can offer meals and wages, if you're willing to work. Eliza looked at him. He looked back at her. Between them, Wren watched them both with the focused intensity of a child who understands that something important is happening. It was not a romantic offer. There was nothing in his face that suggested anything other than calculation and necessity. He needed help. She needed shelter. The math was simple. All right, Eliza said. She picked up the handle of her trunk. I can take that, Silas said, and reached for it without waiting for her answer. She let him, not because she needed him to, but because she was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, and accepting a small help felt in that moment like an act of profound practicality. Wren walked between them toward the wagon, the fable book still pressed against her chest. The sky above the mountains had gone the color of pewter. Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat and looked back once at the train platform. The cracked bench, the scatter of boot prints in the thin snow, the spot where she had sat 40 minutes ago believing she had reached the end of something. The end of the traveling, the end of the uncertainty, the end of being in between. She had not ended up where she planned, but she was not standing still anymore. That would have to be enough. The Calder ranch announced itself from a quarter-mile away by what it lacked. Eliza could see the shape of it through the gathering dusk. The main house solid and square, the barn large enough to be functional, fencing that was maintained but not improved upon. It was a working place, the kind built to survive rather than impress. Every structure said the same thing: someone cares about this, but only barely. She understood that immediately. Grief did that to places. It kept things standing while letting everything that wasn't strictly necessary fall into quiet disorder. Inside, the house was warm from the stove, but dim, and there were dishes in the basin, and Wren's coat was on the floor where it had fallen from a hook that needed tightening. Eliza looked around once, not with judgment, but with the instinctive inventory of a woman who has walked into a disordered space and can see exactly what needs doing. She did not say any of this. "I'll get Wren settled," Silas said, with the exhausted authority of a man managing a one-person operation that requires two. "Supper's usually—" "I'll start supper," Eliza said. He stopped, looked at her. "I can cook," she said. "Unless you'd prefer I didn't." A long pause. Then something in his face released, almost invisibly, like a knot going slightly loose. "No," he said. "That'd be—" Another pause. "Thank you." He took Wren upstairs. Eliza found the kitchen. She found it in the way of someone who has spent years inhabiting practical spaces. By opening the right cabinets first, checking what was available before deciding what to make, noting what was low and what was adequate and what had clearly not been touched in weeks. She found cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans that had been soaked, and the remains of some preserved vegetables. She found a pot that needed scrubbing before it was usable. She scrubbed it. By the time Silas came back downstairs, the smell of actual cooked food had moved through the house like a slow announcement, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway with an expression that Eliza could not quite read. Complicated, she thought. The expression of a man who has gone without something for so long that its return doesn't feel like comfort yet. It feels like a reminder. He sat at the table. Wren came down in her nightclothes, her hair braided unevenly. Eliza could see she'd tried to do it herself, and climbed into her chair. She looked at the food on the table with wide eyes. "Is that beans?" she asked. "It is," Eliza said. "We've been having beans without anything else," Wren said, with the grave reporting tone of a child sharing critical intelligence. "For 3 nights." "Wren," Silas said. "I'm just saying," Wren said. Eliza served the food. She sat across from them at the table because there were 3 chairs and no reason to stand, and they ate. Silas ate with the focused efficiency of a man who eats to continue working. Wren ate with the slow deliberateness of someone testing flavors. Neither of them said much. It was Wren who broke the quiet, toward the end. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, looking at Eliza. "Wren," Silas started. "For a while," Eliza said carefully. Wren considered this. "Will you read to me again?" "If you like." "Okay." She looked at her plate, then back up. "I like the story about the bird that wouldn't leave the tree, even when everyone told it to. Do you know that one?" Eliza shook her head. "I'll show you," Wren said. "I almost know all the words." Later that night, after Wren was asleep and the kitchen was clean and Eliza had found her way to the spare room with its spare blanket and its window that rattled in the wind, she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. She thought about Graham Voss, about the way he'd said those words without a breath of hesitation, as though discarding her required no more consideration than returning a defective tool. She thought about the fire, which she thought about every night, which she had learned to think about briefly and then stop. She thought about Wren's voice saying, "I almost know all the words." She pressed her hands together and made herself breathe. She had come west to build a life. The life she'd planned had collapsed before she could step into it. But she was still here. She was warm, she had eaten, and somewhere down the hall a child who counted months instead of minutes was sleeping with a book about birds pressed against her chest. It was not what she had planned, but Eliza Marlowe had stopped believing in plans on the night her house burned down. What she believed in now was the next morning, getting through to it, seeing what it required of her. The window rattled. The wind pressed against the glass. She lay down and pulled the blanket over her shoulders and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would begin. The next morning arrived the way Wyoming mornings did in January, without apology, without warmth, without any of the soft gradations that made waking up in gentler climates feel like something worth doing. Eliza was awake before the sky was properly light, sitting on the edge of the spare bed with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, listening to the sounds of the house around her. She could hear Silas already moving downstairs, the thud of boots, the heavy metallic complaint of the stove door, a long silence that she recognized as the silence of a man going through the motions of a morning. He had repeated so many times it had stopped requiring thought. She dressed quickly, did her hair without a mirror because the spare room didn't have one, and went downstairs. Silas was at the stove with his back to her, and he did not turn around when she came in, which told her he had heard her on the stairs. He was not a man who startled. He was a man who registered things and filed them away and continued doing what he was doing. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He moved aside from the stove without being asked, which she took to mean she was welcome to use it. She found the coffee first, the real kind, not the sorry substitute she'd been offered twice on the train, and started it before she looked in the cold box and began figuring out what a proper breakfast required. He sat at the table with his arms crossed and watched her work without commenting, which she found she preferred to conversation. Some men filled silence with noise out of discomfort. Silas Calder seemed to understand that silence was its own kind of communication, which in her experience was a rarer quality than most people recognized. "You don't have to do this," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "Do you want eggs or not?" A pause. "Yes." She made eggs. She made biscuits from the flour she'd found the night before, working faster than she strictly needed to because her hands always moved faster than necessary when she was thinking about something else. And she was thinking about the practical realities of her situation with the focused intensity of a woman taking inventory. She had agreed to stay for wages. That was clear. What was less clear was the exact nature of the arrangement, whether it was a week's trial or something longer, what the wages actually were, what was expected beyond cooking and managing the house. These were things that needed to be discussed, and she was not the kind of woman who waited for a man to bring up the subject. "We should talk about terms," she said, setting the plate in front of him. He looked up from the table. "Terms. What you're paying, what you're expecting, how long you need someone." She sat down with her own coffee. "I don't like working in ambiguity." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "That's direct." "I find it saves time." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and she could see him deciding something. Not about her, exactly. About how much to say. $20 a month, he said. Room and board included. The house needs managing, cooking, cleaning, keeping Wren's lessons going. She was doing well before... He stopped, started again. "Before my wife got sick as she was ahead for her age, she's fallen behind." He set the cup down. "I don't have time to sit with her the way she needs." Eliza nodded. "What subjects?" He looked at her like the question surprised him slightly. "Reading, mostly. She gets letters mixed up. Her mother was working on it." He paused. "Math, too. She's better at that. Most children are at her age. Letters require a different kind of patience than numbers." Eliza drank her coffee. "I'll need to assess where she is before I can say how long it'll take to catch her up." "Fair enough." He looked at her steadily. "What about you?" "What about me?" "You came here to marry Graham Voss." She met his gaze. "I came here because I needed a place to be. Mr. Voss made certain promises in writing and then changed his mind when he saw me. Those are two separate things." "Do you know why he's—" "I have no idea," she said. And she didn't, and she had decided somewhere between midnight and the gray pre-dawn that not knowing was something she was going to have to accept, because going to Graham Voss and demanding an explanation was the kind of thing that would cost her more dignity than the answer was worth. Silas nodded slowly. He did not press it, which she appreciated. "Are you planning to stay in Coldwater Junction?" he asked. "I'm planning to stay here," she said. "Past that, I haven't decided." He nodded again, and that was the end of the conversation, because Wren appeared at the bottom of the stairs in her nightgown, with her hair entirely loose and her eyes still half closed. And Silas's face did something complicated and quiet that Eliza chose not to look at too directly, because it was the face of a man who loves something so much it frightens him. And that was not the kind of thing a relative stranger was meant to witness. "There are biscuits," Wren announced, apparently having identified them by smell from the staircase. "There are," Eliza said. "Get dressed first." Wren looked at her. A measuring look, the same one she'd given on the platform. Then she turned and went back upstairs without argument, which told Eliza several things about the child's character, none of them small. Silas watched his daughter go. Then he looked at Eliza with an expression that was as close to gratitude as she suspected he got without visible effort. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She got up and made a plate for Wren. "What?" The first 2 weeks established a rhythm that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional, which Eliza had learned was often better than comfortable. Comfortable could be interrupted. Functional could be maintained. She managed the house with the same systematic energy she had once brought to her classroom, moving through each room with an eye for what was necessary versus what was simply neglected, making decisions without consulting anyone because Silas had made it clear, without saying so directly, that the house was now her domain and he trusted her judgment. It was a practical trust, the kind extended by a busy person to a competent one, but she found she didn't mind that. Practical trust was honest. The pantry she organized in the second week, sorting the preserved goods by type and age, discarding what had gone bad, making a written list of what needed to be replaced before the deep of winter settled in fully. She handed the list to Silas when he came in from the south pasture on a Thursday afternoon, and he looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "You've got a good hand," he said finally. Not about the content of the list, about her handwriting. It seemed to have surprised him. "I taught penmanship for 6 years," she said. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll go into town Friday." "There's coffee on," she said, because he looked cold, and that was the beginning and end of that. Wren's lessons were a different kind of work, the kind that required attention not to the task but to the person doing it, which was the real skill of teaching, and the part that most people who had not done it failed to appreciate. You could know a subject perfectly and still be a useless teacher if you didn't understand how a particular child's mind moved, where it snagged, where it ran ahead. Wren's mind ran fast and snagged on B's and D's, which were the most common snag in the world and nothing to worry about, but which had apparently been treated as a serious deficiency somewhere along the way. Eliza suspected by Silas, who meant well and understood cattle and fence lines and weather systems better than he understood reading acquisition. Wren approached letters with the tense, careful movements of someone expecting to fail. The third day of lessons, Eliza set aside the reading primer and put a blank piece of paper on the table instead. "Draw a bed," she said. Wren blinked. "What?" "A bed. Whatever kind you like." Wren drew a bed. 4 posts, a lumpy mattress, a pillow that looked more like a cloud. "Good," Eliza said. "Now, the B at the beginning of bed. See how the post of the letter goes up first and then the mattress curves out to the right? Like your bedpost and then your mattress." Wren stared at the letter and then at her drawing. Something shifted in her face. "And D," Eliza continued, "starts with the mattress going the other way, to the left, and the post comes after. Like you made the bed first and then put the post in." Wren said nothing for almost a full minute. She was looking at the paper with the intensity of a child who has been handed a key and is checking it against a lock she's been fighting for months. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote both letters slowly, checked them, wrote them again. "Bed," she said. "That's right," Eliza said. Wren looked at her with an expression that Eliza had seen before, on dozens of children in her years of teaching, and which never failed to do something painful and good to the center of her chest simultaneously. The expression of someone who has just discovered that a thing they believed was wrong with them is actually just a thing they hadn't been shown correctly yet. "Why didn't anybody just say that?" Wren asked. "I don't know," Eliza said honestly, "but you know it now." Wren turned back to the primer with an entirely different posture. Her shoulders came down. She read 3 pages without stopping and only stumbled once. That night at supper, she told her father about beds and bedposts. Silas listened with the focused attention he gave everything, and when she finished, he looked at Eliza across the table with an expression that he didn't quite manage to conceal before it rearranged itself into something more neutral. He looked away before she had to. It was in the 3rd week that Orson Vale arrived. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in a buggy that was far too fine for Coldwater Junction's roads, driven by a hired man who stayed with the horses while Vale himself walked to the house with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes arrival is the same thing as welcome. He was perhaps 55, dressed in the manner of a man who wanted to be taken for something between a businessman and a gentleman rancher. Expensive coat, careful boots, a hat that cost more than most men in the county earned in a month. Eliza answered the door because Silas was in the north pasture, and she was the one who heard the knock. Vale looked at her with a brief, recalibrating glance, the kind that men of his type gave to women who answered doors in houses they had expected men to be managing. Then he smiled, and the smile was the practiced kind, warm on the surface and nothing behind it. "I'm looking for Silas Calder," he said. "He's working," Eliza said. "I can send word. What's the nature of your business?" A slight pause. He wasn't accustomed to being asked that at a front door. "I have a long-standing interest in this property. Vale is my name. Orson Vale." She kept her expression entirely neutral. "I'll let him know you called. Do you want to leave a card?" He produced a card from his coat pocket with the ease of a man who had it ready, which meant he had expected to need it, which meant this was not an impulsive visit. She took it, thanked him without warmth, and closed the door. She stood in the front room for a moment with the card in her hand, looking at it. Orson Vale, Coldwater Land and Development, a Denver address. She didn't know why it bothered her. She turned it over. There was nothing on the back, just heavy cream-colored paper and embossed letters. She put it on the mantel where Silas would see it. He came in an hour later, and she watched his face change when he picked up the card. Not dramatically. Silas Calder was not a man whose face changed dramatically. But there was a tightening around the eyes and a stillness that had a different quality than his normal stillness. "Vale came here?" he said. "This afternoon. I told him you were working." Silas set the card down. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was deciding what to say, which meant there was more than one option. "He's been after this property for 3 years, he said finally. "Water rights. We've got the only clean source in a 12-mile stretch that runs across the county line. He wants it." "What does he plan to do with it?" "Develop." He said the word with the particular flatness of a man who has heard it used as a reason for too many things he didn't like. "Says there's money in controlled water access once the railroad expands." He's probably not wrong. "But you won't sell." He looked at her. "No." She nodded. She did not ask more, but she kept the name in the back of her mind, the way she kept things that didn't sit quite right. Not at the front where they demanded attention, but in the place where she filed things she wasn't done thinking about. Silas ate supper that evening with a distraction she hadn't seen in him before. He answered Wren's questions about her reading lesson with half his attention, and when he went out after supper to check the water trough, he was gone longer than the task required. Eliza was washing the supper dishes when Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is Papa worried?" Wren asked. "Your father is fine," Eliza said. "He's got a lot on his mind." "He always has a lot on his mind, but tonight it's different." Wren leaned against the doorframe in the unself-conscious way of children who have not yet learned to make their bodies perform casualness. "He got like this sometimes when Mama was sick. Not the same, but the same kind of quiet." Eliza dried a plate carefully. "Have you eaten enough?" "Yes." Wren didn't move. "Is the man who came the bad kind or the regular kind?" Eliza looked at her. "What do you mean?" "There are regular kinds who come to ask Papa things, and he answers and they leave. And then there are bad kinds that make him go quiet after." She paused. "Mr. Vale used to come twice a year. Papa was always quiet after." 8 years old, Eliza thought, and she reads people the same way she reads books. Not missing anything, just waiting for someone to help her with the hard words. "Go get your nightgown on," Eliza said gently. "I'll come read with you." Wren went. Eliza finished the dishes and stood at the window over the sink for a moment, looking out at the dark where Silas had gone. She couldn't see him. The night was heavy with coming snow. She did not know yet why Vale's card sitting on that mantel made something at the base of her spine go tight. She only knew that it did, and she had learned, in the year before she came west, in the months of sorting through the wreckage of what had been done to her family, that the things which made her spine go tight were generally the things that deserved her attention. She put the last dish away and went to read to Wren. 3 weeks after that, the writer came. He came at midday, which was the detail that stayed with Eliza longest afterward, because meaningful danger, in her experience, announced itself at uncomfortable hours. Early morning, late night. Midday felt ordinary. Midday felt like nothing bad could happen in the middle of the ordinary moving world. He was well-dressed. That was the first thing she noticed from the window, because well-dressed men who rode alone to working ranches in January were either lost or they wanted something specific from someone specific, and the directness of his path toward the house suggested he was not lost. She opened the door before he knocked. He was perhaps 45, lean, with a face that had probably been handsome once, and had moved past handsome into something sharper and less trustworthy. He had dark eyes and a stillness about him that was not the stillness of a peaceful man. It was the stillness of a man who had learned that stillness made other people nervous, and had discovered this was useful. He looked at her and smiled. The smile stopped her breath, not because it was threatening, because she knew it. She had seen it before. She had seen it on the porch of her family home 2 years ago, on the last afternoon she had ever spent there, before the night that ended everything. Her hand, which had been resting on the doorframe, went flat against the wood. "Mrs. Marlowe," the man said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, measured, reasonable. The voice of a man who believed that speaking calmly was the same as being right. "It's been a while." "Mr. Crow," she said. She was proud afterward of how steady her voice was, because inside, in the place that she kept carefully hidden behind everything functional and practical and forward-moving, there was something that felt like the world had just lurched sideways off its axis. Lucian Crow. Here, at this Calder Ranch, 3 miles outside Coldwater Junction, Wyoming. He had found her. "May I come in?" he asked. "No," she said. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is being patient with someone he considers unreasonable. "I've come a long way, Eliza." "You didn't ask for an invitation." "I think we both know that we need to have a conversation." "I have nothing to say to you." "That's all right." He smiled again, and this time there was something different in it, something that reminded her of Orson Welles' smile, the same quality of warmth with nothing behind it. "Because I have something to say to you." She waited. She would not ask what it was. She would not give him the satisfaction of watching her lean toward information he was controlling. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out toward her. She didn't take it. "It's a statement," he said. "A legal declaration regarding the fire at your family property in Harrowfield 2 years ago. It states that the fire was accidental in origin, faulty chimney construction, a tragedy." He paused. "All it needs is your signature." The cold pressed in around the open door, but Eliza didn't feel it. "The fire was not accidental," she said. The official investigation was handled by men who were paid to reach a specific conclusion," she said. Her voice was still steady. She was faintly amazed by this. "I know what happened to my family's home, Mr. Crow. I know why it happened, and I know who was responsible." A beat of silence. Crow folded the document and put it back in his coat. "You've had a difficult 2 years," he said. "Grief does things to memory, to perception." He said it the way a person says something they have practiced. No one would blame you for misremembering the details of a traumatic event. Is that the story you're planning to tell? I'm simply suggesting that things are not always as clear as we believe them to be in the immediate aftermath of tragedy. He looked at her steadily. "Sign the statement. Put the past behind you. You've clearly built something new here, a position, a situation. It would be a shame to lose that over a misunderstanding." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She had replayed the fire in her mind more times than she could count. The smell of it, which had reached her sleeping room first, the way the lower floor had already been burning by the time she got to the hall, the deliberateness of it, concentrated in the wrong places, moving the wrong direction for a chimney fire. The documents that had gone missing from her father's study, the water rights agreements, the land survey. The offer from Crow's development company that had arrived 3 weeks before and been refused. "No," she said. Crow was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, as though she had confirmed something. "I'll come back," he said pleasantly, "when you've had more time to think." He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without hurrying, and he rode out the gate with the unhurried ease of a man who has never believed that refusal was the same as the end of a negotiation. Eliza stood in the doorway until he was out of sight. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door and stood with her back against it and pressed her hands flat against the wood on either side of her hips and breathed. She had known, in some abstract and unexamined way, that this might eventually happen. Crow had wanted her family's land. He had gotten it, by means she couldn't prove. But she was the only remaining person who knew what those means were, and she had made no secret of what she believed. She had told her sister. She had told her attorney. She had written letters that went unanswered by men who had already been told what conclusion to reach. She had come west partly to escape this, partly to put enough distance between herself and the man who had taken everything she had so that she could breathe again and think again and figure out what, if anything, she could do. He had found her. She pushed off from the door. She walked to the kitchen table, sat down, folded her hands on the table in front of her, and made herself think clearly, because the alternative was panic, and panic was the least useful thing she had to offer. There were things she knew. Crow had come here. He had connected her to this ranch. He was connected to Vale. She could feel it the way you felt the shape of something in a dark room, not seeing it but understanding its dimensions. He wanted her signature on a document that would close the legal record on the fire, which meant the legal record was not as closed as he'd believed it was, which meant there was still something that could be done. She pressed her hands together until the knuckles went pale. When Silas came in from the pasture at 3 o'clock, she was still sitting at the kitchen table. The coffee she had made herself was cold and untouched. He stopped when he saw her face. Not dramatically, he simply stopped, and she could see him registering that something had changed in the house since morning. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She told him all of it. Crow, the fire, Harrowfield, her family's land and the water rights and the document he had wanted her to sign. She told it in the flat, orderly way she used when she was keeping emotion at a specific distance from the information, the way she had told it only twice before, both times to people she'd believed could help and who had not. Silas sat down across from her while she talked. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside and the faint sound of Wren's feet moving somewhere upstairs. "You think he's connected to Vale," Silas said. "I think it's not a coincidence that a man who built a development company by acquiring water rights in one county showed up here 6 weeks before the man who destroyed my family's water rights showed up looking for my signature." Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. He looked at the table for a long moment. "You should have told me," he said finally. She met his eyes. "We had an employment arrangement, not a... I didn't think it was... You brought this into my house," he said. Not accusatory, just direct. "Into Wren's house. I needed to know." She held his gaze. "You're right," she said. "I didn't know he'd follow me, but you're right." He was quiet again. Then he nodded, a single motion, as if something had been settled. "In the morning, I'm going to see Bram Kessler," he said. "The sheriff? He's a fair man. He can't do much about a fire in another county, but a man riding onto my property making threats is something he can take an interest in." Eliza shook her head slightly. "Crow didn't technically make a threat. He told you something bad would happen to your position here if you didn't cooperate," Silas said flatly. "That's a threat. Bram will see it the same way." She started to say something about the limitations of what a county sheriff could realistically do. She stopped herself. Because Silas wasn't wrong, and because the impulse to argue against people helping her was a habit she'd developed in a year of people failing to help her, and she needed to be careful about letting that habit make decisions for her. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "You should eat something." She realized she hadn't eaten since morning. "I'll make supper." "Sit," he said. "I'll do it." She looked at him. "I know how to cook," he said, with a trace of something that might, in better circumstances, have been dry humor. "I just don't do it well." He stood up and went to the stove, and Eliza sat at the kitchen table and watched him move through the kitchen with the clumsy, determined competence of a man who had learned to do necessary things out of necessity rather than inclination. And she felt something ease in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite safety, but was closer to both than she had felt in a very long time. Wren came downstairs for supper and looked at her father at the stove and then at Eliza at the table, and visibly decided that whatever was happening between the adults was complicated enough that she should simply sit down and not ask questions. She did so, and she ate supper with the quiet attentiveness of a child who was taking note of everything. And after supper, she asked Eliza to read the fable about the bird who wouldn't leave the tree, which Eliza did, sitting beside her on the narrow bed, while the wind moved around the eaves of the house, and Wren's eyes grew heavy, and her breathing evened out. Eliza turned down the lamp and went to the door. "Miss Marlowe," Wren said, not quite asleep. She stopped. "Yes? Are you scared?" Eliza stood in the doorway for a moment with her hand on the frame. "Sometimes," she said, "being scared isn't the problem. It's what you do with it." A long pause. "My mama used to say something like that," Wren said. Eliza didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have cost more than she had available at that particular moment. "Good night, Wren," she said. "Good night," Wren said. Eliza went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window and thought about what Lucian Crowe had looked like riding away. That unhurried certainty, that ease of a man who had never yet been stopped. She thought about the statement he wanted signed, the language he'd used, misremembering, traumatic events, the passage of time. He was building something, a version of events with her name on it, placed carefully in the official record, sealing off the possibility of any future investigation. He had come here because she was the last person who could stop that from happening. She reached into her trunk and pulled out the small bundle of letters she had brought with her from Ohio. Correspondence with her attorney, copies of her letters to the county investigator, a page of her own notes written in the first weeks after the fire, when everything was still raw and specific and her memory had the terrible clarity of fresh damage. She spread them on the bed and looked at them. She had come west searching for a new life. She had not planned to bring her old one with her, but Crowe had made that decision for her. So the question was no longer whether she would face what had happened. The question was how, and from where, and with whom standing beside her. She looked at the letters for a long time. Then she folded them carefully and put them back in the trunk. And she lay down. And she did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, it was with the particular stillness of a woman who has stopped waiting for the next blow and started deciding where to put her feet. Silas went to see Sheriff Bram Kessler the following morning, and he went alone, which Eliza had expected and did not argue with. She understood that there were conversations between men in small towns that required the absence of the woman at the center of them, not out of disrespect but out of the practical reality that a man speaking on behalf of a woman he employed carried a different kind of weight than a woman speaking on her own behalf to a lawman who hadn't yet formed an opinion of her. She didn't like it. She had learned to work within it. She spent the morning with Wren at the kitchen table, running through subtraction with carrying, which Wren found considerably less interesting than reading, but considerably less threatening than she had a week ago. The child's confidence had changed in ways that were visible and specific. She no longer held her pencil as though preparing for it to betray her. She pressed down with purpose now, made corrections without erasing everything, accepted being wrong about one answer without deciding she was wrong about all of them. "If I have 43 and I give away 17, Wren said, counting on her fingers under the table in the way she thought Eliza couldn't see, I have 26. "That's right," Eliza said. Wren looked up. "How did you know I was counting on my fingers?" "I taught for 6 years, Eliza said. "Children have been counting on their fingers under tables for as long as there have been tables. There's nothing wrong with it." Wren considered this. "My teacher in Laramie said it was cheating." "Your teacher in Laramie was wrong," Eliza said. "The answer is either right or it isn't. How you got there is your own business." Wren looked at her for a moment with the expression she sometimes got when Eliza said something that contradicted what she'd previously been told, a kind of careful recalibration, like a clock being adjusted. Then she went back to her paper. They were still at the table when Silas came back. He came through the front door with the cold still on his coat, and his jaw set in the particular way that told Eliza the conversation had been useful but not entirely satisfying. He hung his hat. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter with the cup in both hands and waited until Wren had finished the sum she was working on. "Wren," he said, "why don't you go see if there's ice on the horse trough?" Wren recognized a dismissal even when it was phrased as a chore. She looked at her father, then at Eliza, then gathered her paper with appointed dignity and went to get her coat. The door closed. Kessler listened, Silas said. But he can't reopen an investigation in another county based on your word alone. He was straight about that, which I appreciated. Silas set his cup down. He can and will take an interest in any intimidation that happens in his county. He said if Crow rides onto this property again, he wants to know. He's going to pay a courtesy call to the hotel in Coldwater Junction, see if Crow's staying there. Is he? Kessler didn't know yet. He'll send word. Eliza nodded. She had expected approximately this. It was not enough, and it was also not nothing, and she had long since learned to count the not-nothings with the same care she counted the problems. He asked about you, Silas said. She looked up. What did you tell him? The truth. That you came here as a mail-order bride, that Voss turned you away, that I hired you to manage the house. He paused. That you're competent and honest, and that I have no reason to doubt your account. The words landed with a specific weight, not the weight of a compliment. It was too plain for that. It was the weight of a man putting his name behind hers, and she understood what that cost in a town where his name was the only currency she didn't have. Thank you, she said. He picked up his coffee. Kessler's a fair man. He won't take Crow's word over yours by default. Another pause. But he also said, he stopped. What? Silas looked at her steadily. That we should be prepared for Crow to try to shape the story before you can. She had already known this. She had lain awake thinking about it most of the night. He'll tell people I'm unstable, she said, that I've misremembered, that I'm a woman in grief making accusations she can't support. That's what Kessler said to expect. His voice was level, but there was something in it, not quite anger, but the ancestor of anger, the thing anger grew from when it was given enough time and enough cause. Eliza stood up from the table. She walked to the window. Outside, she could see Wren crouching by the horse trough, examining the ice with the focused scientific curiosity that characterized everything she approached. And the sight of her was steadying in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the practical reality that this child was part of what was at stake now. Then I need to build something that doesn't depend on being believed, she said. Silas looked at her. What does that mean? She turned from the window. It means documents, paper, a record that exists outside of anyone's version of me. She had been thinking about this. I have letters from my attorney in Columbus. I have my own notes from the weeks after the fire. I need to write to Martin Aldridge. He was handling my family's estate, and ask him to look into any connection between Crow's company and Orson Vale's operation here. You think they're the same company? I think they're the same method. Whether they're legally connected is what I need to find out. She came back to the table and sat down. And I need to do it now before Crow starts building his version in town. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup, then at her, and she could see him doing the calculation that he always did when he was deciding something. The same internal accounting he probably did with weather and fences and cattle, weighing what he had against what the situation required. Write your letters, he said. I'll have them sent with the Friday post. That was all he said. But it was the right thing, and she knew it, and she sat down that afternoon at the small writing desk in the front room, the one that had been his wife's, she suspected, from the careful way no one ever used it. And she wrote the most important letters she had written since the ones that had gone unanswered 2 years ago. And this time she wrote them with the particular precision of a woman who intended to be taken seriously and was prepared to do everything necessary to make that happen. Crow moved faster than she'd expected. By the following Thursday, she could feel it, not in anything specific at first. In the small adjustments of behavior that a woman who has spent years reading classrooms full of children learns to detect before they become visible. The way the woman at the dry goods counter was slightly too careful with her greeting when Eliza came in with Wren on Wednesday afternoon. The way 2 men at the feed store stopped talking when Silas came through the door on Thursday morning and started again after a beat that was a beat too long. The way someone had told someone something and the information was now moving through Coldwater Junction, the way water moved through cracked earth, finding every small gap, settling into every low place. She mentioned it to Silas that evening. I know, he said. He was fixing a hinge on the kitchen cabinet, working with the focused irritation of a man doing a small repair while thinking about a large problem. Dale Mortimer said something to me at the feed store, that a man had come around asking questions about whether there'd been any trouble at my ranch, whether any of my neighbors had concerns. What did you say? I said there was no trouble worth discussing. He set down the screwdriver. But Mortimer seemed cautious, like he'd already heard something and was checking it against what I told him. He looked at her. Someone's been talking to people in town. Crow, she said. Most likely. A pause. He's telling them he's making it sound like he's your family, that he's worried about you. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment Crow had ridden away from the porch with that unhurried certainty. He was not a man who threatened with his fists. He threatened with the shape of reality. He bent the story until the facts fit inside it the wrong way, and by the time anyone looked closely enough to notice, the story had hardened and the facts were stuck. She thought about the writing desk, about the letters she'd sent Friday. It takes time to shape a story, she said, and time is the one thing he doesn't want me to have. Silas looked at her. He wants my signature quickly, because the longer I don't sign, the more time I have to build a record, she said. If I write to Aldridge and Aldridge finds documents connecting Crow's company to Vail, that becomes something a county investigator has to take seriously, regardless of what story Crow is telling in town. She paused. He's trying to discredit me before the documents arrive. That's what this is. Silas leaned back against the counter with his arms crossed. He had the expression of a man who is recalibrating how much of something he has underestimated. How do you know how he thinks? Because he's not original, she said flatly. He did the same thing in Harrowfield. He started with the neighbors, told them my father was difficult, that there were disputes about the water rights that my family had started. By the time the fire happened, half the county believed we were the problem, and that was why nobody asked hard questions about the origin of it. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. He's making the same move here, she said, and the only way to stop it is to be visible, to be present and ordinary and clearly not what he's describing, so that the people in this town can compare his version to the actual person and see the distance between them. Silas looked at her for a long moment. What does that mean practically? It means I should come to town with you on Saturday, she said. Not hidden, not brief. I should be at the market, at the post office, wherever people are, so they can look at me. She paused. I'm not going to defeat this by staying out here and being careful. He was quiet for a moment. She could see the hesitation in him, not about her plan, she thought, but about something else. Something that had to do with what it would mean in a small town for him to appear in public with the woman who worked in his house. She saw him decide. Saturday, he said. Wren will want to come. She's been asking about the library. Coldwater Junction has a library? 2 rooms above the post office. A pause that might have contained in a man with different habits, the beginning of a smile. Don't tell Wren, she'll be up all night. On Saturday morning, Eliza put on her best dress, which was not especially fine, but was neat and well kept, and she pinned her hair with care, and she went to town with Silas Calder and his daughter, and she stood in the market and talked to people with the direct, unhurried manner of a woman who had nothing to be embarrassed about. She introduced herself. She did not wait to be introduced. She told people clearly that she was managing the Calder household and teaching Wren, and she answered questions plainly, and she shook hands with women who looked at her with assessing eyes, and she looked back at them steadily until the assessment resolved into something more like acceptance, which most of the time it did. She found the postmistress, a narrow-faced woman of about 60 named Agnes Holt, who had the particular quality of someone who knew everything that came in and out of a town the size of Coldwater Junction and had formed opinions about all of it. You're the one that came in on the January train, Agnes said. Not unkindly, just categorically. That's right, Eliza said. Eliza Marlowe. Graham Voss's... I was expecting to marry Mr. Voss, Eliza said. He changed his mind. I took a position with the Calder Ranch instead. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, because the only way to diffuse a story was to tell the plain version of it without visible wound. I understand there's been a man asking questions about me in town. Agnes looked at her with a sharp, interested attention. There was a man came in Tuesday, said he was concerned for you, that you'd been not well since a tragedy in your family. My family home burned down 2 years ago, Eliza said. I was a teacher for 6 years before that. I've been running the Calder household for 2 months, and Wren Calder has gone from struggling with letters to reading full chapters aloud. She paused. That's a fairly accurate picture of my current state of health. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression. A decision being made, the kind that in small towns determined a great deal. The man who was asking, Agnes said, left an address. Said he wanted to be notified if you tried to send any unusual correspondence. Cold moved through Eliza's chest. Did he? He did. Agnes looked at her over the top of her spectacles. I don't read other people's mail, and I don't take instructions from people who didn't grow up here and don't pay taxes here. A pause. Your letters went out Friday as posted. Eliza let out a breath she had not been entirely aware she was holding. Thank you, Mrs. Holt. Agnes. The woman turned back to her counter. Give Silas Calder my regards. Eliza found Silas at the lumber merchant's and told him quietly what Agnes had said, and she watched his jaw tighten in the way it did when he had decided that something required action but had not yet determined what action was available. He tried to intercept your mail, Silas said. He tried to find out if I was sending any. She kept her voice low. Around them, the ordinary commerce of a Saturday morning continued. Men loading wagons, children in the street, horses tied to rails. All of it indifferent, all of it normal. Which means he's worried. Or he's thorough. Both, she said. But worried people are thorough in specific ways. He's trying to control what gets out. That means there's something that can get out. Silas looked at her. You sound like you've been thinking about this all week. I have, she said simply. He bought the lumber he needed, and they went to the library above the post office, which Wren discovered with an expression of such profound and solemn joy that it briefly made both adults stop talking about everything else and simply watch her move through the 2 small rooms of books with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. She pulled out 3 books, then a 4th. She looked at Eliza. Can I take them all? Which one do you most want to read first? Wren looked at them. She held one out, a natural history with illustrations of birds and animals she'd never seen. We'll start with that one, Eliza said. Wren put the others back with the careful respect of someone who understands that things she hasn't been given yet will wait for her. It was not a quality that children developed on their own. Someone had taught her that, somewhere. Eliza suspected she knew who. She looked at Silas, who was watching his daughter with that complicated, quiet expression. She's a good person, Eliza said. I know. His voice was rough in the way voices got rough when they were managing something. Her mother was too. Eliza didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer. She just stood with him in the narrow space between shelves while Wren carried her book to the circulation desk with both hands, like something precious. The answer from Martin Aldridge arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later, and it was not the letter Eliza had expected. She had expected either confirmation or a dead end. She had expected Aldridge to either find a clear connection between Crow's Harrowfield operations and Vail's Wyoming network, or to find nothing. The paper trails buried too deep or the company names changed too many times. What she had not expected was the third option. Aldridge had found both, and the picture they formed together was larger and more calculated and more deliberate than even she had understood. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table before Silas came in. When he sat down, she pushed it across to him without speaking. He read slowly. He was not a fast reader. She had noticed that, not as a deficiency, but as a quality. He read the way he did everything, with his whole attention on the thing in front of him, not ahead of it. When he finished, he set the letter down. There are 4 other properties, he said. At least 4, she said. Aldridge found 4 with clear documentation. He says there may be more he hasn't located yet. She pressed her hands flat on the table. The same sequence each time. An offer to purchase, a refusal. Then problems, fences cut, livestock frightened, wells contaminated. Then a fire, or a flood, or an equipment failure that looked like an accident. Then a second offer, lower this time, and then a sale. Silas was very still. Your ranch is the current target, she said. Vail makes the offer. You refuse. Then the problems start. She looked at him. Has anything happened on the ranch in the past year that seemed like an accident? He was quiet for a long moment. Last spring, the north fence line. 3 posts pulled out, not broken. Pulled. I thought it was elk, but the ground was wrong. A pause. 2 of my horses got into something that made them sick. The vet said it was bad water, but the trough was clean when I checked it. Eliza looked at him steadily. They've already started, she said. The word they landed in the room with a specific weight. Not just crow, not just veil. A network. Organized, patient, operating across county lines and state lines, behind a series of company names that changed often enough to be difficult to trace, and not so often that the pattern disappeared entirely. I need to take this to Kessler, Silas said. Yes, but Kessler needs to take it to someone above him. This is bigger than a county matter. He looked at her. She could see him working through it, the weight of what was in that letter, the shape of what they were actually dealing with. You've been sitting on this all morning, he said. I read it when the post came, 2 hours ago. Why didn't you? Because I needed to think before I talked, she said, and because I was frightened, and I didn't want to be frightened at you. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. Something that was neither purely sympathy nor purely practical concern, but something that lived between them. Are you still frightened? He asked. She considered the honest answer. Yes, but frightened is fine. Frightened and moving is different from frightened and stopped. He stood up. He picked up the letter. He folded it with a care that suggested he understood what it was worth. I'm going to Kessler this afternoon, he said. Today, not Friday. I know, she said. He put on his coat. He paused at the kitchen door. Will you be all right here with Wren? It was the first time he had asked her that. The first time the question had carried more than logistical weight. Yes, she said. He went. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after the sound of his horse faded, and she looked at the copy she'd made of the letter before giving him the original. She'd copied it in her careful teacher's hand, every word, because she had learned not to have only one version of an important document, and she thought about the 4 properties Aldridge had found, 4 families who had refused to sell, 4 incidents that had been recorded as accidents, 4 sales that had followed. She thought about what it meant that her family was one of those 4, that the fire that had taken everything she owned and everyone who had been in that house that night was not an act of fury or desperation, but a step in a procedure. A line item in an operation that had been carried out with the same methodical patience before and after. There was something about that knowledge that was both worse and better than what she had believed. Worse because the scale of it was larger than she had understood. Better because a pattern could be proven in a way that a single incident could not. She picked up her pen. She wrote a second letter to Aldridge, asking for copies of all documentation to be sent directly to Sheriff Bram Kessler of Coldwater Junction, Wyoming, with a second set sent to a judge in Denver whose name she had found in the territorial records, and who had a reputation for taking fraud cases seriously. She was blotting the letters when Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway. Where's Papa? He went to see the sheriff, Eliza said. Wren came to the table and sat in her usual chair. She looked at the papers in front of Eliza with the attentive curiosity she brought to everything. Is it about the bad man? Eliza looked up. What bad man? Wren met her eyes. The one who came to the house. The one who made you go quiet, the same way Papa goes quiet, when something's wrong with the cattle. She paused. I was upstairs. I heard his voice. Eliza set down the pen. She considered how to answer. Wren was 8 years old and had already lost her mother, and she deserved to not have the full weight of this dropped on her, but she was also a child who read situations with adult accuracy, and being told something was fine when it was clearly not fine had never sat right with any child Eliza had ever known. There is a man, Eliza said carefully, who did something wrong a long time ago, and he doesn't want anyone to find out, so he's trying to make things difficult for me. Wren absorbed this. What did he do? He hurt my family. A long silence. Wren looked at her hands on the table. Is he going to hurt us? She asked. Eliza thought about the north fence posts, the sick horses, the sequence she now knew. Your father and I are working to make sure that doesn't happen, she said. And we have help, the sheriff, people who are looking into it. She paused. But I won't lie to you and tell you there's nothing to worry about, because you're smart enough to know that's not true. Wren looked up at her. The expression on her face was hard to look at directly. The face of a child doing the specific emotional math of how much safety she actually has, versus how much she had assumed. Then she nodded, slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I was more scared when no one was telling me anything," Wren said. "Now I know what it is." She pulled her natural history book across the table toward her. "Can we do reading while we wait for Papa?" Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We can." They read for 2 hours, working through the first chapter about migratory birds. And Wren stumbled only twice and corrected herself both times without prompting. And outside the winter light moved slowly across the floor, and the house was quiet in the way it was only when both of them were settled and occupied. Silas came back at dusk. He came in with cold on his coat and something different in his face, not resolved, but shifted. Something had happened. "Kessler's taking it to the territorial office," he said. "He has a contact, a man who's been watching Vale's company for other reasons." He hung his coat. "There may be more to this than Aldridge found." Eliza stood up from the table. "What other reasons?" "Railroad contracts." Silas looked at her. "The expansion east of here. There are land parcels tied to the projected route. Several of them have changed hands in the last 3 years in ways that didn't attract much attention individually, but Kessler thinks if someone looks at the full map, it tells a different story. Railroad contracts, water rights, land along the projected expansion route." Eliza had thought this was about water, and it was, partly, but it was also about something bigger. A map being drawn by people with enough money to buy the pieces one at a time, burning out anyone who wouldn't sell voluntarily, moving so slowly and so quietly across such a wide area that no single county had ever seen the whole picture. Until now. "They made a mistake coming after you," Silas said. He was looking at her with the direct, level attention he gave to things he meant. "You kept records. You remembered specific things. And you didn't fold." She had, in private. She had folded many times in the year after Harrowfield, alone in her sister's spare room, unable to get out of bed on certain mornings, unable to stop shaking on certain nights. She had not been the steady, unmovable woman she sometimes appeared to be. She had been a person who was broken and had put herself back together with whatever was at hand, imperfectly, because the alternative was remaining broken. She didn't say any of that. "They made a mistake thinking I would run," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he looked at his daughter, who had fallen asleep at the table, with her head on her arms and the natural history book open beside her. "I'll carry her up," he said. He lifted Wren with the practiced ease of a father who had done it 1,000 times, and Wren made the small, unconscious sounds of a child being moved in sleep and settled against his shoulder without waking. He carried her upstairs. Eliza cleared the table. She put the books away. She banked the stove for the night and checked the door latch and stood in the middle of the kitchen in the quiet house. She was aware, in the particular way you became aware of things when the immediate crisis had moved into a middle distance rather than being directly underfoot, that this house had become something she had not expected it to be. That these two people had become something she had not expected them to become. That the spare room she had agreed to sleep in for one night had become, without any single decision she could point to, the room she thought of when she thought of where she was. She heard Silas coming back downstairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "She's out," he said. "She worked hard today," Eliza said. He came in and poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot that had been sitting since afternoon, which was a thing she had been meaning to mention and had not. He drank it anyway, standing at the counter. "Kessler is going to need you to write out a full account," he said. "Everything from the beginning, Harrowfield, the fire, the documents that were missing, the offer Crow made to your family before the fire, all of it in a signed statement." "I can do that." "He'll want to meet with you." "I know." He set down the cup. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter, and she could tell he was deciding whether to say something else. "Crow is still in town," he said. "Kessler confirmed it. He's at the Caldwell Hotel. He's been there since the week he came here." She absorbed this. Crow staying in Coldwater Junction meant he had not given up, that she had expected. It also meant he had reason to believe he could still affect the outcome by being present. That was worth thinking about. "He'll hear that Kessler went to the territorial office," she said. "Probably fast. Then he'll move." She thought about the 4 properties. The fence lines, the sick horses, the fire that came when the second offer was refused. He's going to do something. He does something when the legal route closes off. He always has. Silas looked at her steadily. What does he do? She held his gaze. He burns things. The words sat in the kitchen between them with all the weight it carried. She watched him take it in, watched him understand not just the abstract threat, but the specific, personal meaning it had for her. What fire had already taken from her, what it would mean if it came again. Then we're ready for him, Silas said. And the way he said it, flat, certain, with the particular quality of a man who has decided something and does not intend to revisit the decision, was the first time Eliza felt something that was not quite safety, but was the beginning of it. Not because she believed nothing bad could happen. She knew better than to believe that, but because she was not standing in front of it alone. She blew out the lamp above the table. The kitchen went dim, lit only by the faint glow from the stove's seams. "Good night, Silas," she said. "Good night, Eliza," he said. She went to her room. She lay down in the dark. She listened to the house settle around her, the sounds of it familiar now in the way that places became familiar when you had lived inside them long enough to know their particular language. The creak of the second stair, the way the north wind caught the eave over the spare room differently than the other eaves, the sound of Wren turning over in her sleep down the hall. She closed her eyes. She did not dream about the fire. That was new. That had not happened in a very long time. She did not think too hard about why it was happening now. She only noted it, the way she noted things that mattered, and filed it in the place where she kept the not-nothings, and let the night do what nights were supposed to do. She gave her statement to Sheriff Kessler on a Wednesday, sitting across from him in the small office above the jailhouse with her hands folded on the table and her voice steady, going through the whole of it from the beginning. The offer Crow's company had made to her father 14 months before the fire. The refusal. The months of smaller troubles that had seemed unconnected at the time. The night the fire started. The documents missing from the study. The investigation that had moved too quickly to conclusions that required the least amount of additional work. Kessler listened the way Silas listened, without interrupting, without the particular kind of nodding that meant a person was waiting for you to finish rather than actually hearing you. He was a compact, gray-haired man, somewhere past 60, who had the quality of someone who had spent decades in proximity to people lying to him and had developed a reliable internal sense for when they were not. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a pencil he sharpened twice during the hour she spoke. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, none of them leading. When she finished, he sat back and looked at his notes. "The territorial investigator's name is Harlan Pruitt," he said. "He's been building a case on Vale's land operation for 8 months. What you've given me connects Crow to Vale in a way Pruitt hasn't been able to document independently." He looked up at her. "You understand that means you're a witness in something considerably larger than a land dispute in one county." "I understand," she said. "It also means Crow has more reason to want you discredited than he did before." He set his pencil down. "I want you to be aware of that." "I was aware of it before I came in this morning," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Silas Calder's a good man," he said. It was not a non sequitur, though it arrived like one. He was telling her something about the shape of her situation from the outside, about what people saw when they looked at the Calder ranch and the woman who was working there. People in this county respect him. That means they're paying attention to what's happening at his place in a way they might not be otherwise. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. "Both," he said, which she appreciated for its honesty. She rode back to the ranch with Silas in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The road was hard with cold, and the sky above the mountains was the particular flat white of a sky that was considering something, and beside her Silas drove with his eyes on the road, and his jaw set in the way it set when he was thinking hard about something he hadn't resolved. "He said you're a witness," Silas said finally. Not a question. "In the territorial case against Vale." He nodded. He was quiet another mile. "Does that change things for you?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He paused, his hands adjusting on the reins without any real need to. "You came here by accident. You took a position here because you had nowhere to go. You've been building something here, and now it's—" He stopped again. "It's gotten complicated, on my account as much as yours." She understood what he was asking without him finishing the question. Whether she regretted being here, whether the complication was more than she'd signed on for, whether she was counting the cost and finding it too high. I had a complicated life before I got on that train, she said. This ranch didn't cause that. Crow caused that. She kept her eyes forward. The only thing Coldwater Junction gave me was somewhere to stand while I figured out what to do about it. He said nothing. And Wren, she added. Wren gave me something to do with my hands in the meantime. She heard something change in his breathing. He didn't look at her, but something in the set of his shoulders released, very slightly, in the way things released when a question had been answered that the person hadn't entirely admitted to asking. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The days that followed had the strange, compressed quality of time that knows something is coming and hasn't decided when. Eliza wrote a second detailed account at Kessler's request. This one specifically about the timing of Crow's appearances, the exact language of what he had said on her porch, the nature of the document he had wanted signed, and she wrote it in the same careful, specific handwriting she had used to teach her students, because she had learned that precision was the closest thing to protection that paper could offer. She and Wren read through the natural history book and started on a collection of American geography. Wren's reading had continued to improve with a momentum that had its own life now. The B's and D's no longer gave her trouble, and she had begun self-correcting in the middle of sentences, catching her own errors with a small frown and backing up and trying again, which was the mark of a reader who had internalized the process rather than simply performing it. She's going to be ahead of her grade by spring, Eliza told Silas one evening after Wren was in bed. He was at the table with the ranch ledger, working through numbers that had clearly not been making him happy. He looked up. Is that so? She has a strong mind for abstraction. She can hold a lot of information at once and see how things connect. Eliza set down her mending. She ought to have more books. The library. She's read everything in the children's section already, and half of what she shouldn't have gotten into. Eliza paused. There are suppliers in Denver. I can write for a catalog. He looked at her for a moment. You're planning ahead. She met his eyes. Is that a problem? He looked back at the ledger. No, he said. Write for the catalog. It was not a large thing. It was the kind of small exchange that happened 50 times a day between two people who shared a house and a set of practical concerns. But she was aware of it differently than she had been aware of the early conversations, aware that something had shifted in the space between them, that the careful professional distance of the first weeks had been replaced by something she didn't have an exact word for. Not closeness, exactly. More like the absence of distance. The way two people stopped noticing each other as separate objects in the room and started just being in the room. She noticed it. She didn't comment on it. There were too many other things happening to spend time on something that hadn't declared itself yet. 3 days later, Crow's story changed. Agnes Holt told her on a Thursday morning when Eliza came in to post a letter. Agnes had the particular quality of a woman who distributed information carefully, saying only what she thought you needed to know, and keeping the rest behind her eyes. But what she told Eliza was specific enough to make Eliza's hands go still on the counter. Crow had been telling people in town that Eliza had stolen from her previous employer, that she had left a position in Ohio under circumstances that the family had declined to pursue publicly out of decency, that her coming west on false pretenses was consistent with a pattern of behavior that her former students' parents would recognize. He said that, Eliza said. Her voice was flat. To Dale Mortimer at the feed store, Agnes said, and to Reverend Clay's wife, which means it'll be at both churches by Sunday morning. She looked at Eliza over her spectacles. I'm telling you because you should know where the fire is before it gets to your house. Eliza stood at the counter. She thought about the family she had worked for in Columbus, the Harrisons. Good people, ordinary people, who had given her a decent reference when she left. She thought about how easy it would be for Crow to have sent a letter, or to have paid someone to send a letter, saying things that the Harrisons had definitely never said, and would have no reason to say, but also had no particular reason to aggressively deny, since denying something publicly required acknowledging it, had been said. She was getting a lesson in how precisely these things worked. Crow didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to plant enough doubt that the people around her spent a little more time wondering and a little less time listening. Thank you, Agnes, she said. What are you going to do? Agnes asked. She wasn't being nosy. She was asking the way a person asks when they want to know if they can help. Eliza thought about it. I'm going to write to the Harrisons in Columbus and ask for a written statement of my employment and departure, she said. And I'm going to ask Kessler to document that this story appeared in town in the same week that he sent his report to the territorial investigator. She straightened. Because if Crow is escalating his attacks on my character, it means he knows the legal situation is shifting against him. Agnes looked at her for a moment. You know, she said, when you first came in here in January, I thought you were just a woman with bad luck. I am a woman with bad luck, Eliza said. You're also something else, Agnes said, and turned back to her counter. Eliza walked out into the cold Wyoming morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the letter in her hand, looking at the length of Coldwater Junction's main street. The town was not large. She could see from one end to the other if she tried. She thought about Crow somewhere in it, in the comfortable rooms of the Caldwell Hotel, writing letters and having conversations, building his version of her from the outside in. She thought about what she had said to Silas about visibility, about being present and ordinary and clearly not what he was describing. She was going to need to be more visible. Silas did not take the news about the new story calmly, but he took it quietly, which was his way of managing things that made him angry. He listened to what she told him at the supper table after Wren was in bed, and when she finished he was quiet for long enough that the stove made several audible sounds in the silence. He's coming at you from two sides, he said finally. The legal case is moving, so he's trying to destroy your credibility before your testimony can matter. Yes. What do you need? She had thought about this. I need people in this town to have a reason to trust me that doesn't depend on my word. References are useful, but they take time and they're easy to argue with. She paused. What I need is for people here to know me directly, not through anything I say about myself, but through what they've seen. He looked at her. You want to do something? I want to offer lessons, she said, to other children in the county, families out on ranches who can't get to town regularly, who don't have access to schooling. I'll come to them if they need. She paused. I know it adds work. I know you'd need to... I'll drive you, he said, or lend you the mare. She looked at him. You're good at this, he said simply, and you shouldn't have to justify yourself to a town one person at a time. Let them see what you do. He pushed back slightly from the table. I'll ask around. There are 3 or 4 families I can think of off the top of my head who've mentioned their children are behind. She hadn't expected it to be that straightforward. She had expected more resistance, not from him specifically, but from the situation, from the practical complications, from the general reluctance of life to allow things to be simple. Why are you... She stopped. He looked at her steadily. Why am I what? She chose her words. You've put yourself in the middle of something that wasn't your problem. You've given Kessler your time, your name, your account of what happened with the fence lines and the horses. You're offering to drive me to neighbors' ranches. She paused. This isn't what you hired me for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What did you think I was going to do? She didn't have an answer. Crow came to my property, he said. He threatened a woman who works in my house. He's told people in town things that aren't true. His voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger exactly, but the bedrock from which anger was cut. And regardless of all that, he stopped. He looked at the table. He looked up. You're not just someone who works here, Eliza. The kitchen was very quiet. She didn't move. She was not certain she was breathing normally. I should check on the south water, he said, and stood, and went out the back door into the night. She sat at the table for a while after he left. The stove made its sounds. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of him moving around the yard, doing the small check he did each evening before bed. The ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into night. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was not a woman who frightened easily anymore. She had lost too much to spend time being frightened of things that weren't yet real. But this, the thing that was growing in the space between her and Silas Calder, this made her careful in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the knowledge that certain things, once broken, did not repair. She had been broken before. She knew what the repair cost. She got up and washed the last of the supper dishes and went to her room and lay down, and she listened to him come back inside and go upstairs, and the house settled around her with all its familiar sounds, and she lay in the dark for a long time with her eyes open before sleep took her somewhere quieter. She visited the Harmon Ranch first, on a Friday morning 2 weeks later. The Harmons had 3 children, 7, 9, and 11, none of whom had had consistent schooling since they'd come west from Kansas 4 years ago. The mother, a thin, wary woman named Cora, who watched Eliza from the kitchen doorway for the first 20 minutes of the lesson, visibly deciding whether to trust the arrangement, was exactly the kind of woman Eliza had taught 1,000 times in a different way. Someone who had learned through experience to be skeptical of things that presented themselves as good. The children were behind but not damaged. They were the way children got when the gap between what they needed and what was available was simply geographical rather than any failure of intelligence or effort. The 11-year-old, a boy named Thomas, had the mathematical aptitude of someone 2 years older than him and a reading level 2 years below. Eliza spent the first hour just finding out where each of them actually was, which was the only honest place to start. When the lesson ended, Cora Harmon brought coffee to the table without being asked and set it in front of Eliza with a directness that was its own kind of statement. "I heard things," Cora said, "about you." Eliza wrapped her hands around the cup. "What did you hear?" "That you stole. That you came here on false pretenses." Cora sat down across from her. "I also heard from Agnes Holt that you're the reason there's a territorial investigation going on into Orson Vale's company. And I know what Orson Vale did to the Packer family on the West Ridge, because my husband used to run cattle with Frank Packer. Before Frank sold that land, he never would have sold in 100 years under normal circumstances." She looked at Eliza steadily. "So I'm more interested in your version of things than in whoever's been talking to Dale Mortimer," Eliza told her. Not all of it. She kept the most legally sensitive parts to herself, the details Kessler had asked her not to discuss widely. But the shape of it, the pattern of it, enough for a woman as intelligent as Cora Harmon to understand what they were dealing with. Cora listened without expression. When Eliza finished, she drank her coffee. "Frank Packer moved his family to Nebraska," Cora said. "They had that land for 22 years. His grandfather built the first structure on it." She set her cup down. "When are you coming back?" "Tuesday, if that suits." "It suits," Cora said. The Harmon Ranch was the first. Within 3 weeks, Eliza was visiting 4 families, twice a week each, covering children ranging from 5 to 13 across 3 lessons a morning. Silas lent her the mare without comment. He had a quality that she had come to depend on without entirely noticing she was depending on it. The quality of making space for her to do what needed doing without turning it into a transaction. The town was changing around her. She could feel it in the small adjustments. The woman at the dry goods counter, who had been careful before now, asked her directly how the children were getting on. Dale Mortimer, who had listened to Crow at the feed store, stopped Silas on the road one Thursday to say, unprompted, that his cousin's daughter had mentioned what a good teacher the woman at the Calder Ranch was. Agnes Holt reported that the story about theft had largely stopped circulating, replaced by a different and apparently more compelling story about a teacher who rode out to homesteads in the cold to teach children who had no other option. Crow's version was losing the competition. Not because people had disbelieved it exactly, but because the person the version described did not match the person they were actually observing, and most people, given enough time and a clear enough contradiction, chose the evidence in front of them. She did not let herself feel safe. She knew Crow too well for that. She was right not to. It was a Tuesday in late February when she woke at 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, moving on pure physical memory. The memory of another night, another house, another smell exactly like this one. And she was already in the hall calling for Silas when the orange light began showing under the bottom of the stairs. Silas was already moving. She heard him on the upper landing, heard him say something short and sharp that she couldn't make out over the sound of her own heartbeat. And then he was coming down the stairs pulling on his coat, and she was beside him. "The barn," he said. His voice was controlled in the specific way voices got controlled when control was costing something. "Get Wren and get her to the north side of the house, away from the barn." "I'll help." "Get Wren," he said, and went out the back. She went upstairs. Wren was already awake, sitting up in bed with her eyes wide and her face doing something complicated and young that reminded Eliza of exactly how old she was and wasn't. "Is the house on fire?" Wren said. "The barn," Eliza said. She was already pulling the child's coat off the hook. "Put this on. Boots. Now." Wren put them on without arguing. She had the boots on in 10 seconds. which told Eliza she had thought about this contingency at some point, because children who hadn't thought about emergencies took longer. They went downstairs and Eliza moved them to the north side of the house, away from the barn, as Silas had said, and through the north window she could see the sky over the barn had gone orange and wrong. "Stay here," Eliza told Wren. "Where are you going?" "To help your father." "But he said—" "I know what he said." She looked at Wren directly. "You stay right here. If the house catches, you run to the road. You run north toward the Harmon place. Don't stop for anything." Wren looked at her with the eyes of a child deciding whether to be afraid and deciding instead to be competent. She nodded. Eliza went out the back. The barn was burning the way she remembered fire burning, with a terrible intensity and focus that went beyond what an accidental fire did, that started from specific points and moved outward rather than spreading naturally from a single source. Even in the chaos of the moment, even with the heat and the noise and the horses screaming inside, she registered it. This fire had been started in more than one place. Silas had the barn door open and was moving the horses out. She went to him. She didn't ask for instructions. She just went to the nearest horse, which was a gray mare in a stall halfway down the center aisle, wild with terror and throwing her head against everything. And she got her hands on the halter and talked low and kept pressure steady and walked her backward out the door, the way she had been taught to move frightened animals by a farmhand. In a summer, she was 12 years old, the way you didn't forget a thing learned in your hands. They got 4 horses out before the southeast corner came down. The sound was enormous, a concussive crash that sent both of them stumbling back from the doorway, and Silas grabbed her arm and pulled her further back, and they stood in the yard with the horses running loose and the barn folding into itself in a column of heat and sparks that went 40 feet into the black sky. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands, in her knees, in the specific way her body was processing the difference between this fire and the other one, because this one she was standing outside of, and the other one she had not been. Silas's hand was still on her arm. "The house?" he said. "Wren's inside. She's all right." He looked at the barn. His jaw was so tight she could see the muscle working. The barn was gone. The structure was still standing in the loosest sense. The walls were there, or parts of them. But the roof had gone, and the interior was entirely fire, and there was nothing more to save from it. The horses were loose in the yard. Everything that had been stored there was ash. He let go of her arm and walked toward the fence line, stopping at a place where the ground was frozen hard. He stood there with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders exactly what he was managing. The particular coiled quality of a man who is doing everything he is capable of to not do something that would make things worse. She walked to him. He heard her behind him and turned around. "I'm going to get my rifle," he said. His voice was very quiet. "No," she said. "Eliza, no." She held his gaze. She could feel the heat from the burning barn on her back, could smell it in her hair. And she knew what it was doing to her, the way certain smells collapse time and put you back in the worst moment you'd ever lived through. And she was still standing upright and still thinking clearly, and she needed him to do the same. "Listen to me. This is what he wants. He's watching this right now from somewhere, and he wants you to go find him with a rifle, so that the story becomes about what you did and not about what he did." Silas was breathing hard. He looked past her at the burning barn. "He destroyed a year's worth of—" "I know." She kept her voice level. "And he will pay for it, through Kessler, through Pruitt, through the record we've been building." She paused. "If you go after him with a rifle tonight, we lose everything we've put together. He will have a story that buries the other story. You in a jail cell, me a witness to your crime instead of his." She held his gaze until she felt him hearing her. "We do this in the open. We make it stick." The fire cracked and settled behind her. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him fighting it. Not the anger, but the uselessness, which was worse than anger because there was nothing to aim it at. The barn was gone. The hours he'd put into it, the cattle that had been sheltered in it through the winter, the tools that couldn't be replaced easily in a county like this one. Gone because a man had decided that the message needed to be sent in a language she already knew. He put his hands over his face and pressed, briefly, then dropped them. "You're right," he said. The words cost him something. "I know," she said. She meant it without superiority. She was right, and it was terrible to be right about this, and she knew that, and she thought he knew she knew it. Wren appeared at the north corner of the house, unable to stay in place any longer. She looked at the barn, and her face did the thing children's faces did when reality exceeded what they had prepared for, and Silas crossed the yard in 4 steps and crouched down to her level and spoke quietly. And Wren looked at the fire over his shoulder with an expression that had moved past fear into something harder and older. Eliza stood where she was. She looked at the barn. She looked at the sky above it, orange and black, the sparks going up into the cold air and dying out one by one before they reached the stars. She thought about Harrowfield, about standing outside a different fire in a different state and being unable to do anything except watch and run. She thought about the year after, the emptiness of it, the way she had moved through the days as if she were standing at a remove from her own life, watching someone who used to be her doing the necessary things. She thought about this yard, this house behind her with its second stair that creaked and its window that rattled in north wind, Wren's natural history book on the kitchen table, the writing desk in the front room, the mare she'd borrowed twice a week for lessons. She thought about what Crow had intended this fire to do. He had intended it to break her the same way the first fire had broken her, to reduce her to someone running again, surviving again, starting over again from nothing in a new place. She felt the heat on her face. She was not running. The difference between this fire and the other one was not the fire. The fire was the same, deliberate, message-heavy, meant to communicate the thing men like Crow communicated when words weren't working. The difference was what existed on the other side of it. Before, she had been standing in the ruins of everything she had. Now she was standing in a yard that had a house still standing in it, and a child who read books aloud at supper, and a man who had turned away from his rifle because she had asked him to. She turned away from the burning barn. She went inside and put the kettle on the stove, because the night was cold, and what came next was going to require that everyone who was going to think clearly start from somewhere warmer than this. She was filling cups when Silas brought Wren inside. The child was quiet in the way that meant she was absorbing something large and was not ready to talk about it yet. Silas sat her at the table and she wrapped her hands around the cup Eliza put in front of her. "We're going to build it back," Wren said. To nobody in particular. Silas looked at her. "The barn," Wren said. "We're going to build it back, aren't we?" "Yes," Silas said. "We are." "Okay." She looked at her cup. "Can I stay up?" "For a little while," Eliza said. Wren nodded. She sat at the table with her cup and her face that had grown up 10 years in the past 2 hours. And they sat with her, and outside the barn went on burning itself down to a foundation of ash and scorched earth and everything Crow had meant that fire to say. Sheriff Kessler arrived at first light. He arrived with a deputy and with the particular expression of a man who has not slept and has had time during the not sleeping to form conclusions. He walked the perimeter of the burned structure. He crouched at 2 separate locations at the barn's exterior. He stood up and looked at Silas. "Accelerant," he said. "Here and here. Started at least 2 points." "I know," Silas said. Kessler looked at him steadily. "Where were you when it started?" "In bed. Eliza woke me." Kessler looked at her. "You smelled it first?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He took out his notebook. He wrote things. "Crow is still at the Caldwell Hotel?" Silas asked. "Was as of yesterday evening," Kessler said. "I'm going there this morning." He looked at both of them. "I want a written account from each of you. When you woke, what you saw, what you did. I want it today." He paused. "I'm also sending a wire to Pruitt. This escalation changes the nature of what Pruitt's office can do. Arson connected to the pattern they've been building." He stopped, chose different words. "This isn't a land deal anymore. This is conspiracy to commit criminal harm, federal territory." Eliza looked at him. "Will they move on it?" "Pruitt's been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence," Kessler said. "He has the pattern. He has the documentation you and Aldridge put together. Now he has a criminal act tied directly to it." He put his notebook away. "Crow made a mistake last night." "He thought it would work," she said. "It worked before." "It didn't work this time," Kessler said. He looked at her in a way that was brief and direct and carried more weight than his tone. "You didn't run." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "I didn't." He nodded. He went to his horse. She stood in the cold morning air with the ruin of the barn behind her, the horses still loose in the south pasture where they'd run in the night, and the first real light of day beginning to come over the eastern ridge. Silas stood beside her. He was looking at where the barn had been with the expression of a man doing arithmetic about loss. "I need to get the horses in," he said. "I'll make breakfast," she said. He started toward the pasture, then stopped without turning. "Eliza." "Yes?" A pause. "Thank you for last night." She knew he was not talking about the horses. "You would have done the same," she said. He turned his head slightly. "I don't know that for certain." She thought about him standing at the fence line with his hands at his sides. The way she had felt, walking toward him, that she was walking toward a moment that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with barns or fire or land schemes. That she was walking toward something in him that needed exactly what she had. Not comfort, not softness, but the particular kind of steady that comes from someone who has already burned once and is still upright. "I do," she said. He went for the horses. She went inside and started the stove. She was making biscuits when she heard the first wagon. She looked out the window and could not immediately understand what she was seeing because it was not yet fully light, and there were 2 wagons coming down the road, and then a third, and then a rider. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front door. By the time she reached it, she could see them clearly. Neighbors. The Harmons, Cora in the wagon box with her husband and their 3 children. Behind them, an older couple she recognized from the market in town. Behind them, Dale Mortimer, the man from the feed store who had listened to Crow, driving a wagon loaded with lumber. She stood in the doorway. More wagons came behind the first 3. She counted them without meaning to. 6, 7, 8. Men on horses. Women in wagon boxes with food covered in cloth. Children sitting on lumber. Silas came back from the south pasture with 3 horses following him and stopped in the yard. And he looked at the road, and he stood very still for a moment. Cora Harmon climbed down from her wagon before it fully stopped. She walked across the yard to Eliza with the direct manner of a woman who has decided something. "We heard it from the Jennings boy this morning," she said. "He saw the smoke at first light and rode to tell his father." She looked at the ruin of the barn, then at Eliza. "Nobody burns a man's barn in this county and expects the county to stand still about it." Eliza opened her mouth. She closed it. Dale Mortimer had climbed down from his wagon and was unloading lumber with his eldest son. The older couple, she learned later their names were the Bradfords, had brought tools. The rider, a rancher named Cole, who Silas knew from years back, had brought 2 other men and a second wagon of timber. She stood in the doorway of the Calder house and watched it happen. She had been alone in this fight for 2 years. She had written letters that went unanswered and talked to officials who had listened with the expression of people deciding how little they needed to do. She had come west to rebuild a life in a place where no one knew her name, and instead of finding anonymity, she had found this. 8 wagons, 40 people, lumber enough to frame a new barn, and Cora Harmon looking at her with steady eyes that said without words that what happened to the Calder ranch had happened to all of them. Wren appeared at her side, pressing against her arm. "Who are all those people?" she asked. "Neighbors," Eliza said. Wren looked at the yard filling with wagons and people and lumber. She looked at her father, who was shaking hands with men he hadn't spoken to in months, his face doing something that she had never seen it do before. Something open and slightly undone. "Are they going to help?" Wren asked. Eliza looked at the yard. She looked at the ruin of the barn and the people moving around it with purpose and lumber, and the ordinary, extraordinary willingness of people who had decided that something wrong had happened close enough to them to require a response. "Yes," she said. "They are." Wren pressed a little closer against her arm. Eliza put her hand on the child's shoulder. She did not say anything else. There was nothing to say that the morning wasn't already saying better. In the sound of wagon wheels and men calling to each other across the yard, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber arriving to replace the smell of ash. They built the barn in a day and a half. Not a perfect barn. Not the barn that had stood there before, which had been built over years with accumulated improvements, and the particular character that structures develop when someone has fixed the same problem 3 or 4 times and learned the right solution on the 3rd try. This barn was faster and rougher, and the east wall was not quite plumb, which Cole the rancher noticed on the 2nd morning and mentioned to Silas with the frankness of a man who believed in accuracy over politeness. and Silas said he'd fix it when things settled, and Cole said he'd come back and help, and that was the end of it. What it was standing. What it was there. By the afternoon of the second day, the horses were back inside and the tools were rehung on new pegs, and Cora Harmon had organized the women into producing enough food for everyone who had come to work, which meant the supper table extended into the yard on planks laid across sawhorses, and 40 people ate together in the cold February air, while the new barn cast a shadow across the scorched ground where the old one had been. Eliza moved through all of it, doing what she did, managing, providing, making sure cups were filled and the food kept coming, and the children who had come with their parents were occupied and not underfoot. She had always found it easier to be useful than to be still, and today that tendency was a genuine mercy, because being useful meant she did not have to sit with what the previous 48 hours had cost her. It was Cora who made her stop. Late afternoon, the light going amber and cold, most of the work done, and the men winding down toward the particular satisfied exhaustion that followed hard physical labor done in company. Cora appeared at Eliza's elbow and took the platter she was carrying out of her hands. "Sit," Cora said. "I'm fine," Eliza said. "You haven't sat down since before sunrise," Cora said. "Sit." Eliza sat. Cora sat beside her on the bench at the edge of the yard. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Eliza looked at the yard, at Wren running between the Harmon children and 2 others she'd met today for the first time, at Silas talking to Dale Mortimer with the ease that had not existed between them 3 months ago, at the new barn standing raw and pale against the winter sky. "You're not what I expected," Cora said. Eliza looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly. A harder woman, maybe. Someone who'd closed off." Cora looked at the yard. Women who've been through what you have usually go one of 2 ways. They go hard enough that nothing can touch them, or they go so careful that they never touch anything either. She paused. "You didn't do either." Eliza thought about that. She thought she had done both at various points in the year after Harrowfield. She had been so hard some days that she couldn't be civil to her own sister. She had been so careful other days that she hadn't left her room. "I don't know that I made a choice about it," she said honestly. "Most people don't," Cora said. "That's what makes it meaningful." They sat in the cold air while the yard moved around them, and Eliza allowed herself, for one careful minute, to feel the weight of what was still unresolved. Crow still uncaptured, the territorial investigation still building, the legal outcome still uncertain. She let herself feel it, and then she set it to one side, because there was a child laughing 30 feet away, and a new barn where the ash had been, and 40 people who had come without being asked, and those things were real right now in a way the unresolved things were not yet. That 1 minute was all she allowed herself. Then she got up and went back to work. Kessler sent word 4 days later. He came himself, which told her before he said anything that the news was significant enough to deliver in person. He came in the mid-morning, and Silas was there, and they sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, with coffee that Eliza made without being asked, and that nobody drank much of. "Pruitt moved yesterday," Kessler said. "Territorial office executed warrants at Vail's Denver headquarters and at the Caldwell Hotel." He looked at both of them steadily. "Crow was taken into custody at 7:30 yesterday morning. Vail was detained in Denver at approximately the same time." The kitchen was quiet. Eliza heard the words. She heard them the way you heard things that you had been working toward for so long, that their arrival felt not like a climax but like a tide going out. A slow reveal of ground that had always been there, just submerged. "On what charges?" Silas asked. "Arson, to start. The evidence from the barn fire was clean. Pruitt's man found accelerant traces consistent with what was used at 2 of the other properties in the pattern." Kessler set his cup down. "Also conspiracy to defraud, witness intimidation, and the federal charge, which is the one that matters, organized land fraud across state lines, which puts it outside any single county or territory's jurisdiction and into federal court." He paused. "The documentation your attorney Aldridge sent, combined with what Pruitt's office had been building independently, gave the federal judge enough to sign every warrant they asked for." Silas let out a long breath. He looked at the table. Eliza looked at Kessler. "The other families. The 4 properties Aldridge identified. Pruitt is reaching out to all of them. Their cases will be reviewed as part of the same federal investigation." Kessler met her eyes. Including the Harrowfield fire. She absorbed this carefully. The Harrowfield fire. Her family's property. The investigation that had been closed too quickly by men who hadn't asked the questions that needed asking. That could take time, she said. It will take time, Kessler said. He didn't soften it. She appreciated that. Federal cases don't move fast, but they move thoroughly, and what Pruitt has built doesn't have gaps that a good defense attorney can walk through. He paused. Your testimony will be required, probably in Denver, possibly more than once. I know, she said. You all right with that? She thought about standing in a courtroom and speaking the specific documented truth about the night her family's home burned down to people who had the authority to do something with it. About Lucian Crowe sitting across a courtroom with a lawyer and no easy way out this time. More than all right, she said. Kessler nodded. He picked up his hat. He looked at Silas. You'll want to get a formal assessment done on the barn damage for the insurance record. I'll have my deputy write up the arson report in a form the insurance company will accept. Thank you, Bram, Silas said. Kessler shook his hand. He shook Eliza's. His grip was firm and brief, and the look he gave her as he released her hand was the look of a man who has seen a lot of things go wrong and takes quiet note of the times they go right. He left. Silas and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with their untouched coffee. It's not over, she said, because it needed to be said. Because she had learned that the moment people decided a thing was over was often the moment they stopped being careful, and careful was what had gotten them here. No, Silas said, but it moved. She looked at him. I was looking at the table, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before. Not relief exactly, but the beginnings of something that relief would arrive at eventually. The particular loosening of a person who has been braced against an impact for so long that the muscles have forgotten how to be anything else. What are you thinking? She asked. She didn't usually ask him that directly, but they were past the point where she treated every question as a potential intrusion. He looked up at her. I was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking about this time last year, he said. When I was coming into town every week and running into Vale's representative and being told in different ways that I was going to have to sell eventually. When I was going home and looking at the ledger and not being able to see how I was going to hold this place together another winter. He turned the cup in his hands. And then the one after that, when Wren stopped talking for about 2 weeks because she was grieving and I didn't know how to help her and there was nobody here who... He stopped. He looked at her. Nobody here, he said. She held his gaze. I'm grateful you missed that train, he said. It came out plainly, the way things came out when a person had stopped managing them. Not the way it happened. The way it happened was... He shook his head. But I'm grateful. She thought about Graham Voss walking away, about standing on that frozen platform with her trunk and $41 and the particular kind of humiliation that happens in public and sinks all the way to the floor of you before you can stop it. She had not been grateful for that in the moment. She had been cold and abandoned and quietly furious in the way women learn to be quietly furious because the other kind costs too much. I'm not sure I'm grateful yet, she said honestly, but I'm glad I'm here. Something changed in his face, simple and real and not managed. So am I, he said. Wren's feet on the stairs interrupted whatever might have come next, which was perhaps right, because some things needed to arrive at their own pace. She came into the kitchen still in her nightclothes because she'd been reading since before breakfast and hadn't gotten around to dressing. She looked at both of them. What happened? She said. The man who burned the barn was arrested, Silas said. Wren was quiet for a moment, processing this with the focused internal machinery that characterized her approach to important information. Is he going to go to prison? She asked. Probably, Silas said. Good, Wren said, with the uncomplicated moral clarity of an 8-year-old, and went to find her breakfast. Spring came slowly to Coldwater Junction, the way it came to High Country, not in a gesture, but in a series of small negotiations with the cold, a little more light each day, a little less ice on the horse trough in the mornings, the mountains to the west losing their hard white edges 1 degree at a time. Eliza taught. She rode the mare out twice a week, and she sat at kitchen tables across 3 homesteads, and she worked with children who were behind and children who were ahead. And one child at the Harmon Ranch, the 11-year-old Thomas, who she suspected was simply more intelligent than his circumstances had allowed anyone to notice. She wrote a letter to the county school board in Laramie about establishing a regular teaching position for Coldwater Junction and the surrounding homesteads. She did not expect a fast answer. She wrote it anyway. She also testified. In early March, she traveled to Denver with Silas, where Wren stayed with the Harmons, which she accepted with the dignity of a child who understood that adult work sometimes required adult travel, though she made Eliza promise to bring back a book, and she sat in a federal building across from Harlan Pruitt and two other investigators, and she gave her account of the Harrowfield fire and everything that had followed it in a formal recorded deposition that took 4 hours and left her wrung out in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Silas was in the waiting room when she came out. He looked at her face and stood up. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He handed her his coat without ceremony because she was cold, and she took it without ceremony, and they walked out of the federal building together into the March afternoon of a city that was full of people who did not know her name or her history, and the anonymity of it was strange after months of living somewhere that knew both. "What did you want to do?" he asked. She thought about it. "Eat something that isn't beans or biscuits." He laughed. It was the real kind. Surprised out of him, short, changing his face entirely. She had heard it before, but not often, and it always did something to the air around them. They found a restaurant that wasn't too formal, and ate a meal that was better than it needed to be, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Crow or Vale or testimony, about what Wren would need for the next level of her education, about whether the east pasture fence was worth replacing this spring or could be managed another season, about a book Eliza had been reading that she thought Silas might find interesting, which she described in enough detail that he said he'd read it if she was willing to wait for him because he was a slow reader. And she said she knew and she didn't mind. It was an ordinary conversation. It was the most ordinary conversation they had ever had, unencumbered by crisis or urgency or the weight of what was coming next. She found she fit inside it comfortably, the way you fit into something that has been made at the right size. He paid for the meal, and they walked back to the hotel in the mild March evening. At the door of her room, he stopped. "Eliza," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression he'd had in the kitchen after Kessler left, something that had stopped being managed. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything about your position at the ranch. Whatever you say." She looked at him steadily. She had an idea what he was going to ask, and she was aware, with the specific awareness of a woman who has rebuilt herself once from nothing and is not interested in doing it carelessly, that her answer was going to require honesty rather than comfort. "Ask," she said. "Stay," he said. "Not as—" He stopped, chose words. "Not as my housekeeper, as my partner, and whatever that means. All of it." He paused. "I know the timing is bad. I know there's still the trial and the testimony and all the things that aren't finished. And I know you could go back east once your family's land is legally restored to you. You'll have the option." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to stay because I want you there. Because Wren wants you there. Because the house is different with you in it, and I'm not interested in it being the other way again." She stood in the corridor of a Denver hotel, looking at a man who had offered her shelter when she had nowhere to go, and had then, over the course of a Wyoming winter, become the person she wanted to tell things to when things happened. Not because he was perfect. He was impatient sometimes and too quiet when he should speak, and he had let the grief of his wife's death sit in his house untended for so long that she had practically had to move it room by room herself. But because he was real. Because when he said something, he meant it. Because he had turned away from his rifle in the dark beside a burning barn, because she had asked him to, and that had cost him something genuine. And the things people did that cost them something genuine were the truest information about them. "The east pasture fence," she said. He blinked. "What?" "You said it might hold another season." She held his gaze. "It won't. It needs to be replaced this spring. If I'm staying, I'd like to do it properly." He looked at her. And there it was again, that laugh, the real one, the surprised one. It lasted longer this time. "All right," he said when he'd gotten it under control. "We'll do the fence. And Wren needs more books. We established that. And I'd like to put a window in the spare room, a proper one, south-facing. It's too dark in winter." He was smiling now. Not the careful, managed expression she'd gotten used to reading for what was underneath it, but the plain version, unguarded. It changed his face into something considerably younger than she'd understood him to be. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It's a list of conditions," she said. "But yes." He held out his hand. She shook it. The handshake was unnecessary, and also exactly right. It was the language they had always spoken, practical and direct, and adding a different language to it could come in its own time. She went into her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap and allowed herself, privately and without drama, to feel the full weight of where she was. Not Denver, not the hotel, not even the question that had just been asked and answered. The larger where. The place she had arrived at after 2 years of traveling through the wreckage of one life towards something she hadn't been able to name while she was looking for it. She had come west to marry a man who walked away from her on a frozen platform. She was going home to a ranch with a new barn and a south fence that needed replacing, and a child who could read full chapters aloud, and a man who laughed when she wasn't trying to be funny. Life was not a story that rewarded you for your suffering. She had learned that, or she had stopped expecting it to be, which amounted to the same thing. What it did sometimes, if you kept moving and kept building and refused at the critical moment to run, was put you in rooms where the right conversations could happen. It didn't do this because you deserved it. It did this because you were there, and you were still. She was still. The Harrowfield case moved through the federal system over the following months with the grinding, impersonal thoroughness that large legal processes had, which meant it was slow and procedural, and required her to write additional statements and respond to questions from attorneys she had never met, and wait for letters that took 2 weeks to arrive from Denver. It was not satisfying in the immediate, visceral way that justice sometimes looked in stories. It was paperwork and patience and the occasional wire from Pruitt's office that told her things were progressing without telling her what progress felt like from the inside. Lucian Crow's trial began in Denver in late summer. She testified for 2 days. She sat in the witness chair and she answered questions in the plain, specific manner she had always answered things. And across the room, Crow sat with his attorney and looked at her with an expression that she had spent months preparing to face. And when she finally did face it, she found it had less power than she'd feared. Not because she'd stopped being afraid of him exactly, but because she was not alone in the room. Behind her in the gallery were Silas and Kessler and Cora Harmon, who had come on the train because she'd said she wanted to, and her husband had not argued. Behind them were the files and letters and documented records that Aldridge and Pruitt had assembled. 2 years of a pattern that Crow had believed was invisible, made visible by the one person he had underestimated badly enough to let live. The defense attorney tried, in cross-examination, to revisit the old story: grief, misremembering, an unstable woman constructing a narrative around a tragic accident. She answered every question the same way she answered all questions, directly, with specifics, without anger and without apology. After the second day, the attorney stopped trying. The jury took 3 days. Guilty on 4 counts, including the arson charge that covered Harrowfield. She was in a Denver hotel room when the wire from Pruitt arrived with the verdict, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hands and read it twice. Silas was beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on the paper, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while in the quiet room while the late summer afternoon moved through the window. She thought about her father, about her mother, who had died before the fire and had therefore been spared it, about the house in Harrowfield that she still dreamed about sometimes. Not the burning version, but the before version, the way it looked on an ordinary morning with ordinary light coming through ordinary windows. She thought about what justice actually was and wasn't. It was not the house given back. It could not be that. What burned was gone, and the people who had been in it were gone, and a verdict in a Denver courtroom did not restore any of that. What it did was put a name on what had happened, an official, documented, legally binding name. And that was not the same as healing, but it was something that healing could eventually build on. She folded the wire carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "I want to go home," she said. Silas looked at her. "Tomorrow morning?" "Tonight," she said. "If there's a train." There was a train. They were on it by 8 o'clock, and she sat beside the window and watched the Colorado dark give way to the Wyoming dark, which was different in the way the dark of a place you know is different from the dark of a place you are only visiting, and somewhere past midnight with the train rocking steadily northward, she fell asleep against the window. She woke when Silas said her name quietly. "Junction in 10 minutes, he he said. She sat up. She looked out the window at the dark planes going past and the mountains just visible against the sky. And she thought about another train, another January, another version of herself arriving at this station with a leather trunk and $41 and the absolute certainty that the worst thing that could happen had already happened. She had been wrong about that. Several worse things had happened since, but she had also been wrong in a direction she couldn't have predicted. That this place, which she had arrived at by accident and stayed in by necessity, would become the place where she decided to be. She married Silas Calder in September, in Coldwater Junction, in the ordinary way of people who don't have any interest in ceremony for its own sake, but are willing to observe the forms that mean something to their community. The wedding was at the courthouse, officiated by a judge who had delivered a verdict against Orson Vale's company 6 weeks earlier, and who seemed to find a certain satisfaction in the juxtaposition. Kessler was there. Agnes Holt was there, which surprised no one. Cora Harmon was there with her husband, and the Bradfords and Dale Mortimer and Cole the rancher, and approximately 40 other people who had decided to attend a courthouse wedding on a Tuesday morning because the occasion seemed to warrant it. Wren stood between them during the brief ceremony in a dress that was slightly too big because she had grown 3 inches since spring and there hadn't been time to alter it properly. She held Eliza's hand on one side and her father's on the other with the composed seriousness of a child who understands that an occasion is important without needing to perform that understanding. Afterward, outside the courthouse in the September sun, Wren looked up at Eliza. "Does this mean you're my mother now?" she asked. The word landed differently than Eliza had expected. Not as a claim or a complication, but as a genuine question from a child who was used to asking genuine questions. She crouched down to Wren's level. She thought about the right answer. Wren had a mother who had mattered enormously and was gone, and Eliza was not her and would not try to be, because pretending was not something either of them was built for. "It means I'm here," she said, "permanently, whatever you need to call that." Wren considered this with the focused internal processing she brought to everything. "Could I call you Mama Eliza? If you want." "I want," Wren said, with the directness she had always had. She stood up and Wren took her hand again, and Silas was there on her other side with his hand at the small of her back in the quiet way he had developed of marking that she was beside him. And the community of Coldwater Junction moved around them in the September morning, doing what communities did, talking and laughing and arguing about where to eat after, and somebody's child crying for reasons that had nothing to do with the wedding, ordinary and real and imperfect, and hers. The first snow of that year came early, in late October, covering the ranch in the clean overnight way that erased the lingering marks of the summer. The scorched corner of earth where the old barn had stood, the boot prints around the new one, the ruts left by the wagons of 40 neighbors who had come to rebuild. Eliza stood at the kitchen window in the early morning with her coffee and watched it. The new barn stood pale and solid against the white. In it, the horses moved in their stalls, visible through the open upper door that Silas had left ajar because the brown mare preferred it that way, and he had accommodated this preference without being asked, which was a quality she had stopped noticing and then started noticing again with the particular attention you brought to things that kept mattering. Wren was still asleep upstairs. Outside, Silas was crossing the yard toward the barn with his collar up, moving through the snow with the unhurried purpose of a man who has lived in this weather long enough to be neither charmed by it nor defeated by it. She had thought about what Cora said to her on the bench during the barn raising, about the 2 ways women went after being broken. She thought Cora was right about the options and wrong about her conclusion, because Eliza had gone both ways at various points, had been hard enough to be untouchable and careful enough to be unreachable, and had not ended up in either place permanently. She had ended up here, in a kitchen with a south-facing window that had been added in July, watching a man she had chosen cross a yard in the snow toward a barn that neighbors had built. She had not arrived here by being stronger than the things that had happened to her. She had arrived here by refusing, at the specific moments that required refusal, to make a permanent decision based on a temporary devastation. By keeping records when everything in her wanted to stop. By walking toward a man at a fence line in the dark, instead of letting him walk into something they couldn't take back. By sitting down with a child on a cracked bench and reading the hard words. The ledger of her life did not balance in any way she would have chosen. She had lost her family, her home, the life she had built before the fire. Those were real losses, permanently real, not redeemed or erased by anything that had come after. But beside them were also real. This window, this snow, this child upstairs who called her Mama Eliza with the same matter-of-fact certainty she brought to everything. This community that had shown up with wagons and lumber. This life that had assembled itself from pieces she had not known belonged together until she found herself standing in the middle of them. Silas came back across the yard. He looked up at the window before he came in, the way he had started doing. A small check, a locating, the habit of a man who had lived alone for long enough that the presence of someone in his house still registered as something worth noting. She raised her hand. He came inside. She heard him in the entryway, the boots, the coat, and then he came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window. He looked at the yard the way he always did in the mornings, checking, assessing, already thinking about what the day required. "South fence held," he said. "Cole did good work." "We did good work," she said. "Cole helped." He glanced at her, that almost smile. "Wren's gonna need new boots," he said, before the real cold. "I already wrote to the supplier." He looked at her. "When did you—" "2 weeks ago. They should be here Friday." She drank her coffee. "Also, I ordered more books. Geography and one on natural science that Thomas Harmon is going to need for the level he's going to be at by winter." He was quiet for a moment. "You ordered books for a student." "He's the kind of student you order books for." Silas turned back to the window. "What would you have done?" he said. Not a question exactly, the voice of someone thinking aloud. "If you'd married Voss." She thought about it honestly. "I don't know. Built something, I suppose. Found a way to make it work." She paused. "But not this." "No," he agreed. "Graham Voss wanted a type," she said. "He had a specific idea of what he was getting, and when the idea didn't match the reality, he walked away." She drank her coffee. "If he'd been different, I would have married him and this would have been someone else's life." Silas looked at the barn, at the yard, at all of it. "I used to think about that sometimes," he said slowly. "How things could have gone otherwise. Ruth, how things would have been different if she hadn't gotten sick, if Wren had grown up with her mother, if I hadn't—" He stopped. "You spend enough time in that, and it'll eat you." "Yes," she said. "Better to be where you are." "Better to be where you are," she agreed. Upstairs they heard Wren's feet hit the floor, the specific sound of a child getting out of bed with purpose, the thump, and then the quick crossing of the floor above their heads. "She's going to come down still reading that natural science book," Silas said. "Probably. We're going to hear about rocks for the next month." "At least," Eliza said. He laughed. She did too. The kitchen around them was warm and smelled like coffee, and the particular smell of a house that has people in it who intend to stay. Wren came down the stairs 2 at a time, which Eliza had told her not to do, and arrived in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her hair entirely loose and the natural science book already open in her hands. "Did you know," she said without preamble, "that rock layers can tell you how old the earth is in that spot? Because different things settle at different speeds and—" "Good morning, Wren," Eliza said. Wren looked up. "Good morning." She came to the table and sat down, still holding the book, her eyes moving between the page and her parents with the quick, connecting attention that was entirely her own. "Did you know, though?" "Tell me," Eliza said, and sat down across from her. Wren told her. She told her about rock layers and sediment, and the way time left its record in the earth without caring whether anyone was reading it. Silas refilled both their coffees and sat at the head of the table with the patient attention of a man who had heard some version of this same enthusiastic early morning report every day for the better part of a year and had not once told her to wait until after breakfast. Outside the window, the snow kept coming down. The barn stood where it had been built by 40 pairs of hands. The horses were in their stalls. The south fence was holding. The world had its record of what had happened here. In the documents filed in Denver, in Kessler's notebook, in the letters sent and received and preserved in Eliza's trunk. The people who had built a system of deliberate harm believed they were operating beneath the level of anyone's attention. They had been wrong. They had been wrong because a woman had kept careful records through the worst year of her life, and had carried those records west in a leather trunk, and had refused at every specific moment when refusal mattered to act like someone with nothing to stand on. That was not heroism, exactly. It was stubbornness made useful. It was the choice, made over and over in the small moments, to behave like someone whose life still had somewhere to go. Wren was still talking about rocks. Silas was listening. The snow fell past the south-facing window in the kitchen of a working ranch in Wyoming, and Eliza Marlowe, Eliza Calder now, though she had not yet entirely grown accustomed to hearing it, sat at the table in the ordinary warmth of an ordinary morning and did not look away from any of it. She had come a long way